we're back with another Protestant take. And just like the last one, it sounds confident, it sounds biblical. But it misses the full context. This time the claim is that Catholics are practicing idolatry, and they're using multiple verses to try to prove it. At first it might sound convincing, but listen carefully because there are some major assumptions being made. Take a listen.
Catholics do practice idolatry when it's biblically defined. They change the 10 Commandments from Exodus 20. They disregard where it says, do not make idols of any likeness of anything in heaven above. He tells them to not even worship or serve them. Nowhere does God approve of any type of worship towards any objects anywhere in the Bible. We even see that the bronze serpent was turned into an idol until it was destroyed eventually by King Hezekiah in 2 Kings. Idolatry to God is an abomination. All throughout the Bible, Ezekiel 16, Leviticus 26, Deuteronomy 27, go read them. Deuteronomy 4:16, no idols are to be formed like man or woman, period. In Deuteronomy 12, we see that God doesn't accept that worship. In Judaism, bowing down, genuflecting, and burning incense was always considered a form of worship. They'll say they're only praying to or honoring the spirit on back of the idol. But both Paul and Moses tell us that it is demons that are on back of them. Paul says that an idol is nothing, and that on back of them are demons in 1 Corinthians 10. Also read Psalm 115. They're dead. Read Jonah 2:8 on the subject. Listen, even if it's not your intention, our opinion doesn't matter. What God says on it is what matters. And we know that idolatry begins by attempting to worship the true God in an unbiblical manner.
They say Catholics are practicing idolatry, plain and simple. In the video, the argument leans heavily on scripture. Exodus 20, Deuteronomy 4:16, Deuteronomy 27, Leviticus 26, even Ezekiel 16, all pointing to the same idea that making or bowing before images is condemned. And on the surface, it sounds airtight. But only if you ignore what those verses are actually condemning. Because every one of those passages is warning against the same thing. Not images themselves, but turning them into gods. Deuteronomy 4:16 warns against making images in the form of any figure to represent false gods. Deuteronomy 27 and Leviticus 26 condemn idols that people set up and worship as divine. Ezekiel 16 goes even further. It's about Israel falling into pagan worship, offering sacrifice and devotion to idols. That's the context. Replacing God with created things.
In Catholic life, we typically distinguish between two kinds of worship. The worship due to God alone and the worship extended to his creatures. And that sounds crazy, but hear me out. So we refer to the first as latria. This would be like adoration, sacrifice. You're rendering your whole life to God as your source and end with the recognition that he is due all praise. The second we call dulia. And now this would be things like veneration, intercession. We're asking
Reverence
for help or we're showing respect towards. And you can think of Anglican marriage vows where you say, I thee worship with my body.
Yeah.
It's to declare worthy, to declare estimable.
Yeah.
It's not saying I render to you my whole life as the source and end thereof. So we have this distinction between latria and dulia, between adoration and sacrifice, and then on the other hand, veneration and intercession.
The video breaks down. Because if all images were forbidden, then God would be contradicting himself. In Exodus 25:18, he commands the making of cherubim for the ark. In Numbers 21:8-9, he commands the bronze serpent. In 1 Kings 6, the temple is filled with carved images. So clearly the Bible is not banning images, it's banning idolatry, which scripture defines as worshipping the creature instead of the creator, Romans 1:25. So the real question is this: are Catholics worshipping statues as gods? Or are they using images as reminders that point to God? Because if bowing automatically equals idolatry, then people throughout scripture would be guilty. Yet they're not. The difference has always been intention. Worship belongs to God alone. And that's the problem with the claim in the video. It assumes something it never proves. Catholics don't believe statues are gods. They don't worship Mary as divine. So calling it idolatry isn't just inaccurate. It's a misunderstanding of both Catholic teaching and the very scriptures being quoted. Welcome back to Catholic Explained. Today we're breaking this down step by step. What idolatry actually is, what those verses really mean, and why this accusation doesn't hold up when you read the full context of the Bible.
It is not idolatry to ask another Christian to pray for you. It's not idolatry to acknowledge the good things that God has done in their life. It's not idolatry to give them a legitimate honor that God has already given them, to honor them with the honor that they have been given by God. It would be idolatry to worship them. So by all means, we do not worship Mary. We don't worship the saints. We don't worship statues. All of that is just basic errors. And the fact that other people, when they made statues, meant it for idolatrous purposes doesn't invalidate that. You don't go and burn down the Lincoln Memorial because you say, oh, it's a giant idol to Lincoln. No, because you understand that it's not. Because the fact that one person might build, for instance, a serpent mounted on a pole for a good purpose, someone else might use it for an idolatrous purpose. That literally happens in the Old Testament, and God orders the creation of the bronze serpent mounted on a pole, a prefigurement, by the way, of Jesus, as he says very clearly in the New Testament, when I'm raised up, like Moses raised up the serpent in the desert. So it is perfectly biblically valid to have religious images. We see them explicitly. For instance, in Exodus 25, when God commands the creation of angel statues, the cherubim, in front of the Ark of the Covenant. So Protestants who say any religious images are evil or idolatrous are failing at a most basic level of biblical literacy. That's just not true. There is no prohibition against images in the Bible. There is a prohibition against idolatry. And those two things are very different. You can have an idol that doesn't have an image. St. Paul talks about the idolatry of money, that covetousness is a form of idolatry. There's no statue, there's no image, it's still idolatry. On the flip side, you can have statues without worshiping them. So if we don't get that basic thing right, then we can't understand the Bible. If we get that basic thing right, then I hope it helps you see this is just not a real reason to reject Catholicism at all.
Before we go any further, let's pause for a second, because this is exactly where most people get stuck. You hear a claim like Catholics are committing idolatry. It sounds convincing. It uses scripture. And in the moment, you're not always sure how to respond clearly. That's why we created Catholic Insight. It's a free newsletter where we break down arguments like this: idolatry, scripture, authority, in simple, direct 3-minute reads so you're not guessing in these conversations. You're ready for them. If you want that kind of clarity and confidence, the link is in the description. Go sign up. All right, let's get back into it. After hearing that claim, the real issue becomes clear. The word idolatry is being used loosely, emotionally, and without precision. And that's dangerous because idolatry is not a small mistake in Scripture. It's one of the most serious sins in the Bible. So if you're going to accuse the Catholic Church of idolatry, you better be absolutely clear on what the Bible actually defines as idolatry. Because the Bible does define it, and not the way it's often presented. Idolatry is not the existence of an image. It is not the presence of statues. It is not even the act of bowing in itself. Idolatry, according to Scripture, is giving divine worship, the kind of honour that belongs to God alone, to something created. That's the consistent pattern from Genesis to Revelation. Romans 1:25 says it directly. They exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator. That's idolatry, not images, misdirected worship. And once you understand that definition, the entire accusation starts to fall apart. Because if the claim is that images themselves are forbidden, then you immediately run into a contradiction with God's own commands. In Exodus 25:18, God tells Moses, "You shall make 2 cherubim of gold on the 2 ends of the mercy seat." These are not suggestions, they are commands. In Numbers 21:8-9, God instructs Moses to create the bronze serpent so that those who look upon it may be healed. In 1 Kings 6, the temple, the holiest place in Israel, is filled with carved images of cherubim, palm trees, and open flowers. These are not acts of rebellion. These are acts of obedience. So let's be honest for a second. If all images are idolatry, then God commanded idolatry. And that's not a position anyone is willing to defend, so something else must be happening. The difference is not in the object, it's in the intention. The Israelites were not worshipping the cherubim as gods. They were not praying to the bronze serpent as a deity. These objects were used as visible signs pointing to invisible realities, and that's exactly how the Catholic Church understands sacred images. But here's where people push back. They'll say, but Catholics bow before statues. They kneel, they pray. That looks like worship. And again, it sounds convincing until you actually read Scripture. Because bowing is not automatically worship. In Genesis 42:6, Joseph's brothers bow before him. Are they worshipping him as God? No. In 1 Samuel 24:8, David bows before King Saul. Is that idolatry? No. Even in 1 Kings 1:23, the prophet Nathan bows before King David. The act of bowing, in biblical culture, is a sign of respect, honour, or submission, not necessarily divine worship. So now we're forced to deal with the real question. What kind of honour is being given? Because Scripture makes a distinction, even if modern arguments don't. There is a difference between worship, which belongs to God alone, and honour, which can be given to others. In fact, Scripture commands honour. The 10 Commandments say, "Honour your father and your mother," Exodus 20:12. That's not idolatry, that's obedience. So when Catholics kneel in front of a statue, the assumption being made is that they are worshipping the material object as God. But that assumption is false. The statue is not the object of worship. It is a reminder, a visual representation, pointing beyond itself. Just like a photograph of a loved one is not the person, but it directs your thoughts toward them. And this is where the accusation completely breaks down. Because the claim depends on a misunderstanding of Catholic belief. Catholics do not believe statues are gods. They do not believe Mary is divine. They do not believe images possess power. Worship, true worship, is directed to God alone. The Catechism is explicit about this. The Mass itself is centered entirely on God. The Eucharist is directed toward God. Prayer is ultimately directed to God. So calling this idolatry isn't just incorrect, it's redefining the term entirely. And here's the deeper issue. The verses often used to support this claim are being taken out of context. Deuteronomy 4:16 warns against making images in the form of any figure, for the purpose of replacing God with created forms. Leviticus 26 condemns setting up idols and bowing to them as gods. Deuteronomy 27 speaks against carved images made as objects of worship. Ezekiel 16 describes Israel abandoning God and engaging in pagan idol worship, offering sacrifice, devotion, and even their children to false gods. All of these passages are dealing with one thing: false worship, not visual representation, not symbolic imagery, but the replacement of God with something created. And that's not what the Catholic Church is doing. In fact, the Catholic understanding is consistent with the Incarnation itself. Because here's something most people overlook. God became visible. John 1:14 says, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." That means the invisible God took on visible form. And once God has revealed himself in a visible way, the idea that all visual representation is forbidden no longer holds. Christ himself is the image of the invisible God, Colossians 1:15. So now the question becomes, if God has revealed himself through the visible, why would using visible reminders automatically be wrong? The issue has never been visibility. It has always been worship. And this is where clarity matters, because without it, everything gets flattened. Every action gets labelled the same. Bowing becomes worship. Images become idols. Honour becomes idolatry. And once you collapse those distinctions, you don't just misrepresent Catholic teaching, you misread Scripture. So let's bring it back to the core. Accusation. Catholics are committing idolatry. For that to be true, one thing must be proven: that Catholics are giving divine worship to something that is not God. And that has not been demonstrated. Not in Scripture. Not in doctrine. Not in practice. What's actually happening is this: Scripture is being quoted without context, actions are being interpreted without understanding, and conclusions are being drawn without precision. And that's why this argument keeps coming up, because it sounds strong at first. It appeals to emotion, it uses serious language. But when you slow it down, define the terms, and read the full context of Scripture, it doesn't hold. Because idolatry is real. It is serious and it is clearly defined, and the Catholic Church, despite the accusations, does not practice it. So now the conversation shifts. Not are Catholics idolaters, but what does the Bible actually teach about worship, images, and honour? And once you answer that honestly, the accusation doesn't just weaken, it disappears.